53 BC. Crassus has led 7 legions deep into the Asian desert. He wants to be another Alexander the Great and march into India. But at Carrhae, the Parthian army stands in his way. The Roman army had formed defensive squares. Most of the officers now wanted to rest their troops until the following morning, but Crassus's son Publius was eager to fight the enemy. Crassus agreed and urged his army on. His soldiers would have to eat and drink while on the march. Eventually, the Parthians came into view. From a distance, they appeared a ragtag bunch. There was little about them that inspired terror. This was because Serena had ordered his cavalry to cover up their armor with blankets and animal skins. Then, as they came close, he gave the order to throw off the covers. Suddenly, the Romans saw rank after rank of cataphracts, their breastplates and horse armor gleaming in the sun. Serena sent 1,000 cataphracts thundering towards the Roman square. But this was exactly the kind of situation the Romans trained for. Superbly disciplined, their wall of shields was impenetrable, even to the heavy spears of the cataphracts. Serena realized that the brute force of his heavy cavalry was not going to break down the Roman defenses. He would have to exploit his mobility and firepower. At that moment, the Roman light infantry charged forward. But a hail of arrows from the mounted archers drove them back. It was a taste of what was to come. What happened next was like a scene from a western. Thousands of Parthian horse archers began to surround the square, pouring thousands of arrows into the densely packed ranks. They used the composite bow. The composite bow in the right hands is a powerful weapon. It's made of different layered materials, like wood, horn, and sinew. This gives it more elasticity, which means that it can store more energy when pulled back. Its normal range is around 220 yards, but experiments have shown that in expert hands, it can be fired to around 440 yards. The arrows penetrated everything, punching through armor and shields. Hundreds of Romans fell. Arms were pinned to shields. Feet were pinned to the ground. They even fired backwards over the shoulder as they rode away. This was the Parthian shot, the origin of our own term, the parting shot. But the bulk of the Romans were still unscathed, sheltering behind and beneath their large shields. Crassus knew that if the square held, the Parthians would soon run out of arrows. This was the problem with archers. They could play a key role in battle, but would eventually run out of ammunition.
Missile weapons in ancient warfare were nothing like as decisive as they had become in modern wars. Because of the low velocity, you could guard against them with shields. So it really was just a matter, usually, of outweighting the enemy's missile supplies.
But Serena had planned for this eventuality. Hundreds of camels loaded with arrows were brought forward to replenish the archers.
The Parthian logistics, the use of camels to bring more water and particularly more armaments in the form of arrows, really just stretched the Romans beyond their limits.
Crassus was now in a desperate situation.
The trouble was, Crassus hadn't had any military experience for the last 20 years. And that was where the great problem was. And he was old.
Crassus sent a message to his son Publius and told him to take 1,000 cavalry and 8 cohorts and attack the Parthian horsemen. Otherwise, the square would be entirely surrounded. When Publius advanced, the Parthians turned and ran. The Romans charged after them. Crassus and Publius thought they had the enemy on the run, but they were in for a dreadful shock. '53 BC. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, has invaded Parthia. He needs a quick victory to increase his political power back home. His son Publius has driven off the Parthian attack. Publius kept up the pursuit, but when the Parthians were some distance from the main battle, the horse archers halted. Then they were joined by the cataphracts who attacked the Romans from the front. The lightly armored Roman cavalry was cut apart by the heavy spear, while the archers rode around firing arrows from both sides. Publius was wounded. He and the other survivors were driven back to a small hill where they made a last stand under the hail of arrows. Publius refused to be taken alive. When he went to stab himself, an arrow pierced his hand, so he ordered his armor-bearer to kill him with his own sword. The Parthians cut off his head and stuck it on a spear. Several miles back, Crassus was completely unaware of any of this. The assault had eased. He had a moment to breathe. But he did not realize it was at the expense of his own son. He disbanded the square and lined up his troops in normal battle order. At that moment, the Parthians returned. To his horror, Crassus saw the lead horseman brandishing his son's head on a spear. It was a devastating effect to all who saw it.
Needless to say, this was rather demoralizing.
This was the final disaster for Crassus. He maintained his dignity. He got through the remainder of the day saying, "It is my loss, it is not your loss. Fight on." But that night, he collapsed altogether. Now the cataphracts attacked the Romans head-on with their heavy spears, while the archers rode around the flanks, raining arrows into the tightly packed formation.
Some of the Parthians shoot directly, others shoot arrows up into the air, which will come down from the top, and you can't use a shield simultaneously against both those.
They have long-range bows and arrows, and the Romans could not close with them. That was the problem. They had to put up with this constant hail of arrows.
But it was close to nightfall, and this saved the Romans. Crassus was too distraught to take any major decisions. When it was dark, Cassius and the other commanders decided to move out of their positions and head for the nearby town of Carrhae. They left behind nearly 4,000 wounded. At dawn, the Parthians rode in and slaughtered all of them. Then the Parthians marched to Carrhae.
Carrhae is not a big place. There's a large army now crammed within its walls. It's not provisioned for a siege. If the Romans simply stay there, then they're going to run out of food. They have to break away to real safety, which is actually up in the mountains, back in Roman territory.
So once again, when the darkness fell, they moved out. But they had gone no distance before they came under attack again. The Parthian archers inflicted massive casualties, but the exhausted Romans kept up a fierce resistance. Crassus's officers covered him with their shields to protect him.
But unfortunately, some of the men seem to see the only way out as being to have a peace settlement. And That's where discipline really does start to break down, when the Surena seems to offer it.
Surena suggested that Crassus meet him to discuss peace terms. The king of Parthia would offer him a truce if he withdrew.
Crassus, his troops said, "Oh, we want to talk. We really want to talk. Everything will be okay. Let's talk, let's talk. You should talk."
Crassus was suspicious, but his soldiers were keen for any chance of survival. The Parthians offered him a horse, and as he mounted it, a scuffle broke out between Surena's officers and his own. In the melee that followed, Crassus was killed. His head and his right hand were cut off.
When Crassus is killed, along with some of his chief deputies, the army really is rudderless. And I think it's hard for us to overestimate how difficult it would be for an ancient army, far from a camp, in adverse circumstances, in a climate that they don't understand.
Now there was a general attack on the remaining Romans. A few escaped by fleeing into the hills, but most were killed or captured. Crassus's glittering dream had become a Roman nightmare. Since he entered Parthia, 20,000 Romans had been killed and another 10,000 taken prisoner. His 7 legions were no more. Their 7 eagle standards had been captured. There was no greater dishonor. Surena returned in triumph to King Herodes. When he arrived, the king was watching a play which featured an actor holding a severed head. He threw him the head of Crassus to hold instead. In the space of 6 months, Crassus has gone from being the richest man in Rome to a prop in a Greek play. 53 BC. Crassus has led 7 legions deep into the Asian desert. He wants to be another Alexander the Great and march into India. But at Carrhae, the Parthian army stands in his way. The Roman army had formed defensive squares. Most of the officers now wanted to rest their troops until the following morning, but Crassus's son Publius was eager to fight the enemy. Crassus agreed and urged his army on. His soldiers would have to eat and drink while on the march. Eventually, the Parthians came into view. From a distance, they appeared a ragtag bunch. There was little about them that inspired terror. This was because Surena had ordered his cavalry to cover up their armor with blankets and animal skins. Then, as they came close, he gave the order to throw off the covers. Suddenly, the Romans saw rank after rank. Their wall of shields was impenetrable, even to the heavy spears of the cataphracts. Surena realized that the brute force of his heavy cavalry was not going to break down the Roman defenses. He would have to exploit his mobility and firepower. At that moment, the Roman light infantry charged forward. Of cataphracts, their breastplates and horse armor gleaming in the sun. Surena sent 1,000 cataphracts thundering towards the Roman square. But this was exactly the kind of situation the Romans trained for. Superbly disciplined,